dirty rags and the pounding of thousands of feet. Today in Hereford, the fate of the man once considered almost as powerful as the king himself is being decided. On November 24th, 1326, the main square of Hereford was packed with people. Noble lords in expensive robes, dignified clergymen, lively merchants, and humble peasants eagerly awaiting the start of a brutal execution. On a raised platform, guards in steel armor chained a man of about 40 years of age. His face was pale and gaunt from many days of starvation, and his once luxurious clothes were torn and smeared with dirt. This was Hugh Dispenser the Younger, once the exalted favorite of King Edward II, and, according to rumors, his secret lover. Now his body was to become a bloody lesson about the fatal price of excessive power and how quickly those who make too many enemies fall. To understand how Dispenser fell so low, we must go back and untangle the complex web of ambition, intrigue, and conspiracy that enveloped the kingdom in the early 14th century. Hugh was born around 1386 to the elder Dispenser and Isabella Bochum, daughter of the Earl of Warwick. From an early age, he was surrounded by court ceremonies, and his father, a loyal vassal of Edward I, instilled in his son the art of court service and forged strong ties between the family and the highest nobility. When Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, a young ruler whose affection for his male friends caused a storm of gossip after the tragic death of Piers Gaveston, a vacancy for a favorite arose in the royal court. After Gaveston's death in 1312, Dispenser seized his moment and gradually drew closer to the monarch. By 1316, he had already taken up the post of royal chamberlain, a position of remarkable intimacy that gave him access to the king's private chambers and his most secret decisions. At the same time, a cunning alliance with the heiress of the Welsh Lord Glamorgan, Eleanor Clare, the king's niece, brought him not only a high title, but also extensive estates in southern Wales. With each new gift, the hatred of the old nobility grew, and Dispenser's appetite seemed bottomless. Taking advantage of the king's influence, he shook up the courts, seized land from enemies and poor widows, and did not even spare his own relatives by marriage. His daughter-in-law almost lost her estate by his personal decree. During the Barons' Revolt in 1321, Dispenser was temporarily expelled from England, and he did not shy away from sea raids on English merchant ships, demonstrating his willingness to go to any lengths for power. However, in 1322, the king suppressed the rebellion and restored his favorite. Upon his return, Dispenser was more untouchable than ever before. Between 1322 and 1326, the Dispenseries, father and son, did not simply participate in government, they were rulers within the government. Hugh the Younger controlled access to the monarch, managed the royal treasury, and held vast territories in his hands. It was said that England was ruled not by the king, but by his loyal servant. How could a simple nobleman usurp the throne? Hugh Dispenser the Younger held private audiences with Edward II, managed the royal revenues, and owned lands from Wales to Yorkshire. Medieval chronicler Jean Frew stated that he was King of England in all but name. However, rumors of a secret relationship between the favorite and the monarch caused even more of a stir. Although Edward was married to Isabella, daughter of French King Philip IV, there was talk of sodomy, which became the main accusation in the eyes of the church and the nobility, who considered it a crime against the divine order. Deprived of influence at court due to Dispenser's interference, Queen Isabella lost access to her children and means of subsistence. In 1324, Hugh Dispenser the Elder seized her estates in Essex, arrested her ladies-in-waiting, and transferred custody of the king's children to his son, responding to the queen's protests with threats of further repression. Driven out by hatred for the king's favorites, in 1325, Isabella left for France to conclude a truce, and there met Baron Roger Mortimer, who had escaped from a London prison. Mortimer was a powerful aristocrat whose family had suffered at the hands of the Dispensers, and who had miraculously escaped execution. Their alliance, forged by a thirst for revenge and political calculation, grew into love and led to a joint plan to overthrow Edward II. In 1326, with the support of mercenaries, Isabella and Mortimer landed in England, and the nobility, impoverished by high taxes, judicial arbitrariness, and land confiscation, immediately rose up against the king. Left without support among the barons, Edward and both Dispensers fled to the southwest of the country, taking the royal treasures with them. However, Hugh Dispenser the Elder was captured in Bristol, hanged in heavy armor, then beheaded and quartered, and his remains were thrown to the dogs, a shameful end for a man who had devoted decades to service. Edward II, together with the younger Dispenser, attempted to escape, but in mid-November 1326, they were caught up with at the River Nit. The king was imprisoned, and a week later, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. Hugh Dispenser the Younger, realizing that there would be no mercy, went on a hunger strike, but his strength left him too soon. On November 24, 1326, a court presided over by Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and the barons of Lancaster brought formal charges against him of treason, theft, embezzlement, abuse of power, and sodomy. Despite its appearance of legality, the trial was doomed. The verdict had been decided before it even began. No one expected that the triumph of revenge would turn into a true spectacle of hellish horror. In November 1326, Hereford Square became the scene of the most brutal execution in English history. Hugh Dispenser the Elder, accused of usurping power under Edward II and bringing the kingdom to poverty and turmoil, was sentenced to death with maximum publicity. Just last year, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer landed in Cornwall with French mercenaries, and having secured the support of discontented barons, marched rapidly towards London until Dispenser's influence finally collapsed. On November 24th, he was brought to the market square, where Isabella herself, Mortimer, the victorious barons, and thousands of ordinary townspeople had gathered. First, the prisoner was tied to a high ladder so that no one could doubt his helplessness. A wreath of nettles was placed on his head, a sharp parody of the royal crown, which he essentially shared with the king, and biblical quotations condemning pride and evil were carved into his naked skin. Then, according to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the executioners cut off Dispenser's male organs and threw them into the fire right in front of his eyes, as if in punishment for his wicked ties to the monarch. Still hearing the suffocating screams, he felt his abdomen being cut open and his entrails slowly removed, which were immediately thrown into the flames. His wild, animal-like roar echoed across the square and caused the crowd to cheer. Only after this unimaginable agony was Dispenser hanged, but even in death he was not spared. His body was beheaded, cut into 4 pieces, and sent to different cities in England, and his head was impaled on a stake at the gates of London so that anyone who dared to abuse royal power would see his future. Such exceptional cruelty served not only as revenge for Dispenser's tyranny and greed, but also as a symbolic cleansing of the kingdom from the filth that, according to many, he had brought with his influence on the king. 4 years later, in December 1330, his widow, Eleanor de Clare, received permission to collect and bury the remains on the family estate in Gloucestershire, but it turned out that only the head, thigh bone, and a few charred fragments remained of England's greatest dignitary. The fate of Hugh Dispenser the Younger was no less grim. Held in prison, he was killed in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. According to one version, which is disputed by modern historians, a red-hot iron rod was inserted into his rectum so as not to leave any external traces, and thus hint at his wicked inclinations, a cruel metaphor for retribution, as poetically perverted as his father's execution. The reign of Edward II and the fall of the Plantagenets remains one of the most turbulent periods in medieval England. For centuries, their history was colored by homophobia and moral condemnation, portraying the king as weak and driven by his own passions, and Hugh himself as an unprincipled manipulator. However, modern historians are increasingly turning to political intrigue, economic crises, and the complexity of human nature, without which it is impossible to understand the tragedy of that era. Even the dead were not spared. The body of the royal favorite was torn to pieces and displayed at the most remote crossroads of the country. Modern historians paint a much more complex picture than the grim legend of Hugh Dispenser, who was famous only for his greed and cruelty. On the one hand, they acknowledge that he was indeed an unscrupulous adventurer who squandered the fortune of the English nobility in a short time and made many sworn enemies, from barons who lost their estates to knights whose castles he confiscated for King Edward II. The harsh measures taken by the rebellious lords led to the adoption of the so-called ordinances, and in 1322 both Dispensers were expelled from the kingdom. But 2 years later, Edward II secretly returned Hugh the Younger, granting him even greater power, the title of Earl of Pembroke, and generous grants for his participation in campaigns against the Welsh and Scots. On the other hand, doubts remain about the veracity of rumors of his intimate relationship with the king, since accusations of sodomy in medieval England were often used as a political weapon and a way to discredit an opponent. In any case, the fate of Hugh Dispenser became a vivid testimony to the turbulent intertwining of power, sexuality, and politics. His mutilated, dismembered body was intended to remind everyone of the consequences of violating social norms and the danger of making powerful enemies. The sentence was handed down in 1326 by the usurpers, Queen Isabella and her favorite, Mortimer.